Gaza and the humanitarian situation. Minister Anneliese Dodds.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I'll update the House on the ceasefire agreement in Gaza and detail our latest efforts to get aid to those in desperate need. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a fragile ceasefire, but it brings much-needed hope for the Israeli and Palestinian people. The agreement to end the fighting and release the hostages is what this Labour government has been pressing for from the moment we came to office. I thank Qatar, Egypt and the US for their tireless efforts and echo the Prime Minister in wishing Emily Damari and the other former hostages well as they begin to recover from their horrific ordeals. We continue to call, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the immediate release of all of those still waiting to be reunited with their loved ones, including the remaining hostages with links to the UK. Madam Deputy Speaker, civilians in Gaza have endured suffering that defies belief, and this deal brings hope that they can start to rebuild their lives. In the days since the guns were silenced, Israel has opened up mechanisms to surge in aid. The UN and aid organisations have been working tirelessly to deliver the humanitarian aims of the ceasefire agreement. After so much time waiting at the border, delays I saw for myself in December, trucks are now streaming in. Partners on the ground report that more than 200,000 food parcels have been dispatched to more than 130 distribution points since the ceasefire. This government, Madam Deputy Speaker, has been at the forefront of the humanitarian effort in Gaza since we came into office, overturning the suspension of funding to UNRWA and then boosting our support, supporting UK-Med field hospitals to help the injured, working with Egypt to support those medevaced out of Gaza and providing vital resources to UNICEF and the World Food Programme. Today, I'm pleased to announce that the UK is investing in the ceasefire. UK support will be distributed to the UN and key medical partners so that tens of thousands of civilians get the healthcare, food and shelter they need. That support will amount to £17 million from the UK to get more aid into Gaza and restore services. The figure also includes £2 million for the World Bank to support the construction and restoration of critical water and energy infrastructure. The UK has already helped around 284,000 people in Gaza to access water, sanitation and hygiene services. Today's uplift brings our commitment to the occupied Palestinian territories and Palestinian refugees in the region to £129 million this financial year. I'm also pleased to announce to the House that this morning Jordanian Air Force helicopters started landing in Gaza with UK-funded medical supplies and logistical support from UK armed forces. I thank Jordan for their excellent commitment to getting aid in such challenging circumstances. We will continue to support our Jordanian partners in this initiative. But more action is needed. The air bridge to Gaza is no substitute for road routes, which must remain open. We also call on Israel to allow more essential items like tents, mattresses and medical equipment in. As people start to move home, basic services need to be put back in place and unexploded bombs and mines cleared. Without this, even more lives will be lost. And of course, the UN and humanitarian agencies must be able to operate freely. This government has repeatedly stated the need for UNRWA to continue its life-saving assistance to the people of Gaza, Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Knesset legislation taking effect on the 30th of January risks impeding the progress made since the ceasefire. Israel must allow the agency to continue to operate. The legislation does not and cannot change the fact that Israel has a responsibility under international law to facilitate humanitarian assistance. As the UN Security Council heard last week, 1 million Gazan children need support to process their traumatic experience. Their suffering cannot be underestimated. And around 15,500 patients need medical evacuation, according to the World Health Organization. Routes must be opened for them to get this treatment. Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK and wider international community stand ready to support Palestinians as they begin to rebuild their lives, their homes and their communities. We are under no illusions concerning the scale of the challenge ahead. The overwhelming majority of homes in Gaza are damaged or destroyed. The economy has collapsed and basic services, including energy and water, have been knocked out. So we are working with partners to urgently find ways to best finance and support recovery and reconstruction efforts. It's essential that the coming surge of assistance is properly coordinated and with the access and security to reach those in need. The Palestinian Authority has a crucial role to play, and we're providing technical and financial assistance to the authority, including to support the urgent recovery of basic services. Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK has always been clear that this ceasefire is just the first step. We must build confidence on all sides to help sustain it, progress through all its phases, and turn it into a lasting peace that assures the security of Israelis and Palestinians alike. The UK will focus all of our efforts on keeping up the momentum using every diplomatic channel available. As you will know, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary and the Minister for the Middle East kept up the drumbeat of engagement during their visits to Egypt and the United Nations last week. We will keep up the pace until every hostage is released, aid reaches all those in need, and Palestinians are able to rebuild their homes and their lives. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel.
Madam Deputy Speaker, since the savage terrorist attacks on October the 7th, 2023, we all in this House have called for the release of all hostages held by Hamas as the only way of reaching a sustainable end to this absolutely abhorrent conflict and to alleviate the enormous scale of the humanitarian suffering. And we now both feel the anxiety and hope of the families who have waited, anticipating the release of the remarkably brave women hostages returned thus far under the ceasefire agreement, including, of course, the British-Israeli hostage Emily Damari. And I want to pay tribute to the families of all hostages for their unwavering campaigns to secure the release of their loved ones. They should never have been put through this unimaginable nightmare. And we did very sadly learn yesterday that 8 of the hostages will not be returning home alive, having been killed at the hands of Hamas. This will be devastating news to hostage families who continue to face the unbearable uncertainty in the days and weeks ahead. There is a long road ahead, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we've heard already from the Minister that we want the ceasefire agreement to hold, and we must stress that every single hostage must be released. The important issue now around humanitarian access remains, and as the Minister has already said, we must ensure that this House receives the relevant updates around both the hostage releases, but also every single diplomatic tool that Britain has when it comes to removing the barriers to getting the hostages out, but also getting the right amount of aid in. We all saw on our television screens yesterday the scenes of thousands of Gazans returning to the north, where we recognise the situation is extremely difficult. So can the Minister give a breakdown of the volume and the type of aid that the UK is sending in, and the impact and how this will be measured? Notwithstanding the deliveries by helicopter that the Minister has mentioned, is she confident that British aid is getting over the land borders as expected and being effectively distributed to help those in need? On the £17 million that she has mentioned, can she clarify to the House whether this is new money or whether it's part of money that has been released from previous funding allocations? And can she further tell us which organisations this money will go to fund and support? The Minister has rightly mentioned UNRWA, and while no one can doubt the size of its distribution network, we cannot ignore the problems within the organisation, and it's in nobody's interest to just pretend that they have not happened. We know the facts. UNRWA staff and institutions have been infiltrated by Hamas, including the shocking allegations of UNRWA staff involved in the 7th of October attacks. So following the United Nations internal investigations and the subsequent sackings, the coroner report and reforms need to be implemented in full. And may I ask the Minister, is this something that she is overseeing in order to give our public, but the public and donor countries, greater confidence in UNRWA and the efficacy around the way in which UNRWA are progressing when it comes to the vetting of their personnel and on procedures to protect the neutrality of their operations and facilities, and share the evidence with this House as to the work that has taken place? In July, the Foreign Secretary announced £21 million for UNRWA, and the Prime Minister announced £13 million last month. What measures are in place to ensure that every penny of British taxpayers' money is going to those most in need and not being abused by Hamas? Without losing focus on the challenges of the immediate term and obviously the phase of the ceasefire, the government does also need to be thinking about what next, laying the right foundations for the future reconstruction and the development that needs to take place in Gaza. This is a huge task. So what discussions has the government had with neighbours, regional neighbours? What role does she envisage for the UK to be playing? Will Britain financially be contributing? And is she pushing for multilateral institutions to be involved? On the future governance of Gaza, I have said this previously as well. I would like to hear more about the government's Day One plan. The Foreign Secretary previously told the House that there cannot be any role for Hamas. I echo those words too. But we did see the sickening sight of Hamas gunmen parading around hostages just last weekend, and that does cause great alarm. So can the Minister say what steps is being taken to end the reign of terror that Hamas has unleashed? She's also mentioned the PA, the Palestinian Authority. Now, if they are to assume responsibility in Gaza, then what action will be taken to ensure that they are reforming? They must reform with serious, measurable, tangible reforms on education, their welfare policy and also democracy. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, everyone in the House knows that the root cause of so much suffering in the Middle East is down to Tehran and the Iranian regime. Can the Minister speak at all about the efforts that this government is making to work with the international community to have a robust strategy towards the Iranian regime?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for her support for the approach that is being taken by the UK Government. I absolutely agree with her around, of course, the savagery of the 7th October attacks and the suffering that has been undergone by the families of the hostages. Madam Deputy Speaker, I met the brother of Emily Damari when I was in Tel Aviv. I have to say it's difficult to find the words to reflect on that experience and what he was going through at that time, and indeed the families of other UK-linked hostages who I met when I was in Tel Aviv. Of course, their suffering continues as they await, hopefully, their return, which we are all hoping fervently for. I'm very grateful to her for underlining the need for, of course, the ceasefire to hold. We need to see that move through phase 1 into phase 2. It's absolutely imperative that those measures are held to by all sides, that we see all hostages being released, and then, as she said, the surge of aid into Gaza that is so needed. We will absolutely keep the House updated on the diplomatic measures that we are taking. We've been doing that consistently across our team in the FCDO. We'll continue to do that. She asked whether we are confident, Madam Deputy Speaker, that aid will be getting where it is needed. Yes, we are. The contributions that we've announced today, much of them are going from the crisis reserve into the pool arrangements. That is a system that is designed to ensure that there is that support going directly into shelter, food and medical supplies as well. Absolutely critical that we ensure that that support is available directly. She asked about UNRWA also, Madam Deputy Speaker, and of course we have spoken about this before, but just to reiterate, when the UK resumed its support for UNRWA, we were very clear that the findings from the Colonna report had to be implemented. In fact, £1 million of the £21 million that we provided to UNRWA at that point were earmarked to support that reform programme. This is something that I've discussed directly with the head of UNRWA. I know that my colleagues have done it repeatedly. I've also discussed it with UNRWA staff in the region, and indeed I saw it for myself, that work, particularly around neutrality, when I was in the West Bank, so I can assure her of UK Government commitment in that regard. She asked penultimately, Madam Deputy Speaker, about reconstruction and what conversations we've been undertaking in that regard. We have been working with the international community, having many discussions with partners as well, bilaterally, around this. Of course, the most important thing is for the ceasefire to hold. I know she would agree with that. But when it comes to reconstruction and recovery, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've been particularly working with the World Bank. She may be aware, of course, that they conducted a rapid needs assessment, very helpful process which is being updated. But also we have been, indeed, as she referred to, having those discussions discussions intensely with the Palestinian Authority. She will be aware that Sir Michael Barber, who comes with incredible expertise, has been supported by the UK Government to work with the PA. I have seen his work. I've discussed it directly with the PA myself when I was in the West Bank. It is indeed aiming at those measurable, tangible reports and precisely in the areas that she mentioned. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, she asked us to underline the fact that the UK Government's position is that there will be no role for Hamas. Absolutely, I will do that again from the dispatch box, and the Foreign Secretary has made that very clear indeed. Thank you.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm very pleased to welcome the statement of my right honourable friend. I just wondered if she's able to expand a little bit on the technical and financial assistance that she's providing to the Palestinian Authority, but also in terms of, we know there are tens of thousands of tonnes of unexploded ordnance, what's happening around that. And finally, what interventions has the government made about the imminent closure of the UNRWA warehouse on the West Bank? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising these issues, as of course she has done consistently over time. First of all, in terms of how the UK is working with the Palestinian Authority on these issues, that support has included financial assistance around the reform programme, but also that direct technical support around the reform programme that's necessary. There is substantial reform that's needed. There is a clear plan that has been driven by the Palestinian Authority, but we are determined to provide that technical support, and we have been doing so. On the issue of unexploded ordnance that she mentioned, clearly this is of huge concern, particularly as we see people coming back to their homes, and there is that great danger that in doing so they will be impacted by unexploded ordnance. Clearly there's a need for education around this, for knowledge and awareness raising, but there will also be that need, and is that need, of course, to remove that material. It's very important. So the UK has been working with other countries and internationally around how we can ensure that that's the case, that these communities will be safe to return to. And she finally asked around the storage of UNRWA supplies and so forth. We're very clear, as we have been before, that UNRWA must have that key role in delivering humanitarian support and indeed health and education services to Palestinians, whether that's in Gaza or the West Bank or the wider region. Thank you.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Monica Harding.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I join colleagues in supporting efforts to uphold the ceasefire agreement and releasing the hostages? I wish to express my heartfelt condolences to the families of the 8 hostages who have been killed by Hamas whilst taken hostage. And I join members of the House in calling for the immediate release of all those still waiting to be reunited with their loved ones. I also want to denounce statements made suggesting Palestinians should forcibly be displaced from their homes to other regions in the Middle East. The only clearing out that should be taking place is the unexploded ordnance across Gaza, where UN demining experts estimate 5 to 10% of all ordnance is unexploded. So what support specifically is the UK government providing to support the safe demining of the region and alongside that, the estimated unaccompanied children, of which there are estimated to be 17,000. Israeli legislation seizing UNRWA's operations is also due to take effect this Thursday, posing a huge risk to responding to the humanitarian response, the delivery of education and of primary health care. Dismantling UNRWA now, outside a political process, will undermine the ceasefire agreement, sabotage Gaza's recovery and weaken the international humanitarian response. So what steps is the Minister taking to ensure the continuity of humanitarian aid to the occupied Palestinian territory, given the ongoing existential threat against UNRWA's operations?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for the points that she has made. I would also wish Madam Deputy Speaker to join her, of course, in expressing very sincere condolences to the families of those 8 hostages who will not be able to be back with their families, as is, of course, their right, and as so many of us had hoped would have been the case. They must be suffering intensely now, Madam Deputy Speaker. Her point about displacement, of course, is well made. The UK position is very clear. The UK believes that international humanitarian law must be held to, that it must be feasible, possible, and indeed a reality that Gazans are able to return to their homes. That includes in northern Gaza. That has consistently been the UK government's position. She asked about mine clearing and unexploded ordnance. As I mentioned in my response to the Right Honourable Lady a few moments ago, it really is important that we see those areas being safe for people to come back to. I spoke with some specialists in this area myself, Madam Deputy Speaker, last week. I know how meticulous and difficult that work is of removing unexploded ordnance, and the UK is engaged actively with experts considering what role we might be able to play, but above all ensuring that there is a coordinated approach to this across our partners and international institutions as well. She asked about children, Madam Deputy Speaker, and that has been the situation for children has been a priority for the UK government, as indeed I would say with the previous government as well. We have ensured that particularly support from UK Med is provided for children. We've seen, unfortunately, of course, that pressure on children's health coming through the situation with polio. Of course, the UK was heavily involved in seeking to deal with the vaccination campaign, and we will continue to ensure that we can do what we can to support children, particularly following the trauma that they have experienced. And just finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the issue of UNRWA, she's absolutely right. Of course, that deadline is coming up very, very speedily in 2 days' time. The UK government remains absolutely committed to our position that no other organisation can operate at the scale or depth of UNRWA. It's absolutely essential for providing both direct humanitarian supplies and health and education services to Palestinians, and we'll continue to make that very clear, as we have done repeatedly, both to our Israeli counterparts but also multilaterally and to our other partners as well.
Laura Kyrke-Smith.
Glad to hear of the uplift in funding for Gaza, and I share the Minister's serious concerns about the effective ban on UNRWA coming into force this week. Of course, 60% now of the food that has entered Gaza during the ceasefire has been through UNRWA. And in the West Bank, UNRWA plays a vital, life-saving and stabilising role in terms of providing education to 50,000 Palestinian children, healthcare, clean water, rubbish collection. What reassurances has the Minister had from Israel that if UNRWA can no longer operate, there is a viable and humane alternative way of getting that support into Palestinians?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and of course she has considerable experience on these issues, as do many other members in this House with a background in humanitarian services. The UK government is very clear. UNRWA underpins the entire humanitarian response in Gaza. It has a vital role in delivering both the uplift in humanitarian assistance that we need to see following the ceasefire, but also, as she rightly mentioned, education and health services as well. We are opposed to the Knesset legislation that was previously passed, and we call on Israel to work urgently with international partners, including the UN, so there's no disruption to this vital work.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I commend the Right Honourable Lady, the Development Minister, on her statement to the House today, which I think she would agree continues the drive and commitment of the last government. Can I particularly applaud what I think she made clear, which is that it is the policy of the British government that any plans for the future governance of Gaza will involve a reformed Palestinian Authority and categorically rule out any role for Hamas. And will she reflect with me that in a week where we've seen the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and the release of these terrified young hostages, that it is deeply depressing that anti-Semitism is alive and well and often expressed through hatred of Israel?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable gentleman for his remarks, and I am indeed grateful for the work that was undertaken by the previous government when it came to humanitarian support in this area. Obviously, we have sought to build on that, to deepen that, and to make sure that we are at the forefront of our responsibilities in this area. I am very happy to confirm, Madam Deputy Speaker, that he did indeed summarise exactly the position of the UK Government when it comes to the future of Gaza. It must be a future that is determined, of course, by Palestinians, by Gazans themselves, with the PA having that role, but not with Hamas having any role. And on the issue of anti-Semitism, Madam Deputy Speaker, of course, this week of all weeks, we must redouble all of our efforts to make sure that we never forget the horrors of the Holocaust and that we always resolve to combat any form of prejudice and discrimination, including anti-Semitism. Thank you.
John McDonnell.
Can I thank our colleagues on the front bench for the work that they've done and the commitment that they've shown. And the focus on Gaza today is critical for all those across the House to ensure that we do our best to deliver. But my concern is that Gaza could be easily destabilised by what's happening in the West Bank, and in particular the invasion in the last few days of the Tulkarm refugee camp and the killing of further Palestinians. Can I ask our government now to make representations to the Israeli government to show restraint and to prevent the further loss of life, of Palestinian life, by these attacks by the IDF?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as my honourable friend rightly said, stability in the West Bank is crucial to ensure what is a fragile ceasefire in Gaza can last. All sides must be working to ensure a lowering of tension in the West Bank at this time. And I can reassure him that we have been continuing to call on Israeli authorities to exercise restraint, adhere to international law and clamp down on the actions of those who seek to inflame tensions. That is in no one's interest.
Dr. Andrew Murrison.
Before the current crisis, construction in Gaza was made very much more difficult because of the surprisingly long list of proscribed materials, including things like drain pipes, which Israel feared could be used as componentry for weapons and understandably was uncomfortable with. What can we do going forward to ensure that the strip can be rebuilt with all the materials that will require, whilst giving reassurance to Israel regarding diversion by Hamas, or what remains of it, and other Iranian proxies?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the honourable member for raising this critical question, because he is right. A key enabler for Gaza's recovery will be the ability to get goods and materials in at the required pace and scale. It's our position that the enabling conditions for early recovery must be provided in the coming weeks, including secure access corridors. They really are important, and the resumption of basic services as well.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Minister's statement and the announcement of additional vital UK support for Palestinians at this most crucial time, and I join her in recognising the crucial work of Jordan in particular. Does the Minister join me in condemning the legislation passed against UNRWA by the Israeli Knesset, which jeopardises the entire international humanitarian response in Gaza? And what concrete action will our government take if the Israeli government moves ahead with implementing this at the end of this week?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for underlining the role of Jordan here. I've seen that for myself in both of my visits to Jordan, quite how committed the Jordanians have been to ensuring that aid is able to get into Gaza. We really are grateful to them, and indeed for the partnership that they have shown with the UK. When it comes to that legislation in relation to UNRWA, the UK government has been very clear that decision by the Knesset was wrong. It's a decision which will undermine the ceasefire. It's a decision which will prevent the delivery of much needed humanitarian aid, but which will also prevent the delivery of education and healthcare in particular. That is why once again we call on Israel to change tack on this and not to implement that legislation.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over the weekend, President Trump inserted himself into the debate on the future of Gaza and its people, saying, "You're talking about 1.5 million people and we just clean out the whole thing? Is it the government's view that what he was talking about was the forced displacement or ethnic cleansing of almost 2 million Palestinians from their land? And if that wasn't the government's understanding of what he meant, what exactly was their interpretation of what President Trump said?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UK Government recognises the critical role that both the current administration, of course the previous administration in the US as well, played towards obtaining the ceasefire that has been so critical here, as well as the efforts of Qatar and Egypt too. On the question that he raised around whether Gazans are to be able to return, of course they must be able to return. They must be allowed to return. That is very clear under international humanitarian law, as indeed he knows. Thank you.
Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for coming to the House with this statement today, and I'm sure members right across the House are watching, making sure that this agreement does last so that we can see people returning back to their homes and building some sort of future. Tomorrow I'm due to meet with the Bethlehem Kennington Link, a voluntary group in my constituency dedicated to helping Palestinians caught up in the conflict. They've raised with me the alarming situation in the Ada camp, an UNRWA-funded refugee camp between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Sadly, Israeli Defence Forces have repeatedly vandalised this camp and threatened workers with intimidation. And the Minister's outlined the situation with UNRWA funding, and given that Israel is due to sever ties with UNRWA later this week, can the Minister please look at urgently directing support, that any support that the UK can give to the Ada camp?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising the critical role of UK civil society when it comes to supporting people, whether in Gaza, the West Bank, or indeed the broader region. That really is incredibly important. I'm also grateful to her for raising the issue of aid workers' safety as well. This is a conflict that has been the most deadly for a very, very long time. In fact, I believe since records began on these matters for humanitarian workers. Of course, the UK Government will look very closely at where our support is being provided, as I said previously, to the Right Honourable Lady, and ensure that it's getting where it's needed. Thank you.
Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The horrendous scenes we saw at the weekend of Hamas terrorists parading the brave hostages before they were returned. Also, the horrendous scenes we saw of Hamas terrorists shooting fellow Palestinians for alleged collaboration, and the statement from the Hamas leader that he and his team are vowed to return to rule Gaza, and also to carry out repeatedly events, atrocities that were committed on the 7th of October, shows that Hamas are not going away, and it's quite clear they're determined to get back in control in Gaza. So the key issue here is we all agree that Hamas should not be in charge of Gaza. So how is it going to be achieved?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I agree with the Right Honourable Member when it comes to those scenes. Indeed, the Foreign Secretary has been very clear about this, including from this dispatch box as well. Of course, he will be aware that the UK Government's position on this could not be clearer. Hamas is a terrorist organisation. It's an organisation which must not play a role in future arrangements for Gaza, and we will seek to work with all of our international partners and indeed with the UN towards that end.
Matthew Patrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whilst Hamas were busy smuggling weapons and spending money building tunnels to hold hostages in ahead of their barbaric attack on the 7th of October, the people of Gaza relied each and every day on aid coming in. For those of us that want to see a two-state solution with a peaceful and prosperous Palestine, could she set out what assessment she has made that the role of UNRWA can play in the long-term role for that, and how we can ensure that aid gets to those that need it, not to the terrorists who are trying to take it away?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising the importance of us always having that lodestar of the two-state solution as what we must aim at. Both Israelis and Palestinians rightly have as something that they deserve, a state of security, that sovereignty also that he, I know, is committed to also. And when it comes to the role of UNRWA, clearly we have been having, as I said before, many discussions with the leadership of UNRWA and other international partners. Ultimately, if we are to see a two-state solution in the future, that would enable also the normalisation of the economy that is needed and hopefully a shift away from the humanitarian situation that has been the case for so many years. On the issue of reconstruction as well that he mentioned, of course we're discussing this with a number of UN partners, but I would again mention here the World Bank, which has been doing so much work, particularly about how finance can be accessed. But of course a precondition for that is the ceasefire holding, which we continue to push for.
Jess Brown-Fuller.
Deputy Speaker, according to the UN, 1.9 million people in Gaza, which is 90% of the population, are currently displaced. Half of these are children. So how will the Minister work to secure the right of return and self-determination for Palestinians in Gaza, and in light of the calls from the US President to clean out Palestinians from the region?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. She is right, of course, with the figure that she quoted, and in some cases Gazans have been moved up to 9 times because of recent events. She describes the situation as one where Gazans have the right of return, and of course I would underline that word right. They do have that right. That right is clear under international humanitarian law, and it's one that the UK will seek to ensure becomes a reality. Thank you.
Mari Rimmer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We must build confidence on both sides to help sustain the peace that's there. But how are we going to do it? We have people that have left Palestine before, war areas before, and never got back. 70,000 people, 70,000 families, and many of them still have their keys. I've got family, I've got friends with the families. They never got back to see their grandparents, and they got back once a year after that. How do we build confidence in anybody to move out of the destruction that's there, particularly in northern Gaza, to get their confidence to come out while it gets rebuilt? We can't do that. How are we going to build confidence for them? And how are we going to build confidence in the families and loved ones of the hostages that are still held there? They fear that Netanyahu will sacrifice them for the war to be returned. And they're planning, with IDF coming, actually saying we will not be a second phase of this peace. How do we build confidence? My heart is with everybody that's involved in this. And I know people want peace, but that's the facts, and they're the risks that we've got to identify and we've got to resolve. I don't know how we're going to do it. God knows.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I think the passion with which my honourable friend just spoke is one that so many members in this House, of course, share. And it can feel almost impossible, particularly after a conflict where so many people have been killed, so many thousands have died, sometimes impossible to see a way through. But it is our responsibility as the UK, working with our partners, working multilaterally, to seek to reach towards that peaceful future, one of 2 states where Palestinians and Israelis can live in security. We must aim towards that. And I would say, Madam Deputy Speaker, it will be particularly important, of course, for all of us as parliamentarians and for the UK government not to shift away from this crisis, as perhaps some of the coverage of the media might start to diminish as days and weeks go on, but to keep up that pressure so that we really can ensure the future that both Israelis and Palestinians deserve. Thank you.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. De-radicalisation must form a key plank of any reconstruction in Gaza, along with, as the Minister rightly says, ensuring Hamas have no role in its future running. Yet a sickening reality on the ground is that in textbooks and school curriculums in UNRWA schools in Gaza, there are materials that promote anti-Semitism, that incite hate against Jews and Israel, and that promote violence. Unless we stamp out and get rid of that hateful incitement to violence that are being put in front of school children in Gaza, there can be no successful and peaceful future. So what is the Minister doing in her conversations with UNRWA, whose schools this is in, to stamp that out?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, the issue of what's often called neutrality of UNRWA is incredibly important. It is one that I have discussed in detail with the leadership of UNRWA. I've also gone myself to see this in practice, to understand the reforms that have been undertaken. We talked previously, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the Colonna report. That was a very important report that set out practical steps in order to deliver that neutrality. The UK Government has directly supported that with the £1 million of funding that we earmarked to that end as part of that £21 million that we announced some weeks ago. So we are absolutely committed to this and for those reforms to be not just implemented, and many of them have been, but for them to be sustained as well.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. No one can fail to be moved by the powerful scenes of Palestinians returning to their homes in Gaza, even though their homes have been reduced to rubble by the Israeli forces. Of course, it's important that we do everything we can to rebuild Gaza, but justice for war crimes is also vitally important. So, will the Minister agree with me that we must stand up to all those who wish to undermine the International Criminal Court investigations and do all we can to ensure justice is done?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I think we've all seen on our television screens some of those scenes, just as he said, of Gazans returning to their homes, which in many cases, of course, have been destroyed or heavily damaged. And of course, for many of those people, they will have lost family members as well. So this really has been an incredibly difficult process for many Gazans. He talked about the International Criminal Court, and of course, the UK Government has been absolutely clear. The UK respects the independence of the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Before I call the next member, I am going to finish this statement at 15:15. Please, can questions be a great deal shorter, and perhaps respectfully, Minister, answers as well. Carla Denyer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Minister's statement. The suffering of civilians in Gaza is extreme, and I share the Minister's call for the immediate release of all those still waiting to be reunited with their loved ones. Does the Minister agree that we urgently need accountability for the Israeli government's violations of international law as exhibited in the restriction of access for tents, mattresses, medical equipment and so on that the Minister mentioned? And does she acknowledge that the only way that we're going to be able to progress meaningfully towards reconstruction efforts and longer-term peace is to hold the Israeli government to account for these actions?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UK is fully committed to international law and respects the independence of the ICC, as I said, but also of the ICJ. And yes, there must be access to supplies such as those she mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Minister for her statement and the announcement of additional investment in aid to Gaza, which is very welcome. I visited UNRWA schools and healthcare facilities in the West Bank, and the role that UNRWA plays in the provision of essential services, including aid to Palestinians, is unique and irreplaceable. The implementation of the Knesset decision to ban UNRWA could therefore amount to the denial of health services, education and essential aid to a population who have already suffered unbearably for the past 15 months. So can the Minister say not only that the UK Government is opposed to the decision, but what will be done to hold the Israeli Government to account for the impact of it if it is implemented later this week?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, the UK has already acted to be clear that there must be a resolution to this urgent issue. We've joined with allies in expressing our deep concerns about that Knesset vote on UNRWA. We've urged Israel to ensure that it can continue its life-saving work, and that's included at the UN Security Council on the 6th of November, 11th of December and 3rd of January. Thank you.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Minister for her statement. Today is the 9th day of the siege by Israeli forces accused of war crimes on Jenin in the West Bank, with over 3,000 Palestinians forcibly displaced. Jenin Hospital under lockdown without water and electricity, and at least 14 people killed by the Israelis since the beginning of the ceasefire in Gaza. The UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights have said that they are deeply concerned by the use of unlawful lethal force in Jenin, including multiple airstrikes and apparently random shooting at unarmed residents. Can the Minister tell the House what specific and concrete steps the government is or will take to facilitate an end to Israel's siege and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. He asks about the UK Government's representations in relation to the West Bank. Well, we've been very clear, Madam Deputy Speaker. The risk of instability is serious. The need for de-escalation is urgent. We continue to call on Israeli authorities to exercise restraint, adhere to international law and to clamp down on the actions of those who seek to inflame tensions. Thank you.
Kyrke-Smith.
Speaker, I welcome the Minister's update of the Government's efforts to get aid to those in need in Gaza, but given the serious allegations of war crimes that have occurred in Gaza, what steps is the Government taking to ensure that those are properly investigated and those responsible held to account? Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I have said previously within this debate, the UK is fully committed to international law. It respects the independence of the ICJ and the ICC, and any such determinations around the conduct of war by whichever party is concerned would be taken by those independent bodies, by experts, by judicial actors and lawyers, and not by governments. Thank you.
Lee Dillon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And in following brevity, can I ask the Minister when is the correct time to recognise Palestine as a state?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, he will know that the UK Government is committed to the recognition of Palestine, but it's committed to doing it in a manner that will ultimately support that peace process. The Foreign Secretary has set that out in detail, in fact, just a few days ago from this dispatch box. Thank you.
Sana Begum.
Mr. Speaker, when the Ukraine war started, a mechanism was put in place for the evacuation of injured children from Ukraine to hospitals here to ensure that they had the appropriate treatment. It seemed to have worked effectively, and it was the right thing to do. In light of the ceasefire in Gaza, in light of the fact that in northern Gaza the healthcare facilities have been decimated, can I ask the Minister whether this government will now instigate a scheme for the seriously injured children of Gaza, including orphans, like we've done in Ukraine, by simply establishing a system to ensure that they can be brought here for medical treatment?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's vital that Israel ensures that there is a sustained passage for patients who need treatment not available in Gaza during the first phase of the ceasefire. We announced £1 million, of course, to the Egyptian Ministry of Health and Population, delivered through WHO Egypt to support medically evacuated Palestinians from Gaza, and officials from across all relevant Whitehall departments are exploring avenues to ensure our support best meets the needs of critically ill people in Gaza. Thank you.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker. We welcome the release of the hostages, though for 8 families it will be a sad day when they realise that their loved ones were murdered while in captivity. Israel has taken considerable risks, withdrawing troops, opening borders and having the ceasefire agreement, while at the same time Hamas still continue to attack them in the West Bank and also humiliate hostages to show that they're in control. Since the Hamas have used aid in the past to exercise control on the Palestinian population, and there are huge links between UNRWA and Hamas. What steps is the Minister taking to ensure that UK aid is not used by Hamas to re-exercise control in Gaza?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. He's absolutely right about the absolutely devastating time that those families of the 8 hostages he mentioned is going through. Really terrible, and important to underline this, of course, at the same time as there's extreme relief for those who have been able to return to their families. The UK has been consistently working hard on this, the need to ensure that aid gets to where it really is needed. We've been working with a number of UN agencies on this, and of course also bodies like UK Med as well. Thank you.
Ian Byrne.
Deputy Speaker, at the weekend, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, called for, and I quote, a clean out of the Gaza Strip, proposing to forcibly deport Gaza's more than 2 million Palestinian inhabitants. This would amount to ethnic cleansing, and it would be a crime against humanity. So will the Minister join me in condemning President Trump's remarks, and will she set out what actions the UK government would take to prevent the ethnic cleansing of Gaza?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would refer my honourable friend to my previous remarks. The UK Government has been very clear that Gazans must be able to return to their homes. That's a matter of international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Despite genocide,
displacement and destruction, Palestinians are returning to northern Gaza and remain rooted in their land. The Minister has been asked a number of times in respect of President Trump's remarks about what appears to be yet again a forced displacement. What is the position of the Minister and her government in respect of President Trump's remarks?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think I may have said perhaps 5 times now that the UK Government is absolutely clear that Gazans must be able to return to their homes. That includes in northern Gaza. That's a very clear matter of international law. Thank you.
James Frith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her statement and her even-handedness, both in the British Government's position on increased aid to UNRWA, as well as confirming there can be no role for Hamas in future governance. To peace building, the UK has a strong track record of bringing people together across communities to build peace, no more so than in Northern Ireland. What lessons in support for civil society and peace building in Israel and Palestine will the government draw from the last Labour government's experience in Northern Ireland?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And he is right to be absolutely clear that, of course, the UK does have considerable expertise in the area of peace building, as indeed on so many other questions that we've been discussing here this afternoon. It really will be important in the future that we do all we can as a country to pursue that goal of peace, the two-state solution we talked about before. But of course, we must, in these immediate months, make sure that the ceasefire is held to. Thank you.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The fundamental issue is Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. What assurances has she had from the Israeli government that they will withdraw all their forces from Gaza and that they will eventually, if not sooner, withdraw from the West Bank to allow the Palestinian people to decide their own future in peace?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have discussed many of these matters directly with Israeli government counterparts. I've also myself been to the West Bank so that I could understand the situation with illegal settlements more directly. The UK government's position is very clear. Illegal settlements are illegal. They are not allowed under international law, and we remain determined to make that very clear, not just to, of course, the Israeli government, but to all of our other partners and multilaterally as well. Thank you.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for her statement, but also the Foreign Office's diplomatic efforts in securing the early release of Emily Damari, something here in the House we have all been hoping and praying for. Will the Minister assure the House that you will use that she will use those same diplomatic efforts to secure the early release of British-related hostages in Phase 1, and that the next phase of the deal is agreed?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are absolutely determined to do all that we can to ensure that the UK-linked hostages who remain, of course, Eli Sharabi, Oded Lifshitz and Avanatan Orr, are brought home to their loved ones. We call for their immediate release and will do all in our power to secure that. Thank you.
Jim Allister.
Okay. No one can gainsay the need for humanitarian aid. But looking forward to the reconstruction phase, what enforceable assurances are there that aid provided by this government will not be diverted to rebuilding terrorist tunnels, as happened in the past? And can she trust the United Nations Relief Work Agency when it comes to that, given their record, given the suggestions that there were tunnels built under their very headquarters, that they had a data centre there flowing off the UNRWA's electricity supply? Can we place trust in an organisation with such a record?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Absolutely, the prevention of diversion of aid, not just in this context, but more broadly, wherever the UK is providing aid, is incredibly important. It's something that we take very seriously indeed, and we will always seek to ensure that there is absolutely watertight control around this, wherever UK taxpayers' money, of course, as this is being used to support some of the most in crisis people on earth. He asked about the issue of UNRWA's neutrality. We have covered this previously in the statement, but I would just point again to the work that the UK has undertaken by providing support for UNRWA to implement the Kelowna report. Thank you.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are about 1 million children in Gaza, and to put that in context, we have about 1 million children in Scotland too. Before I was elected, I worked for Save the Children, and I've met the children of the Palestinian refugee camps. Well, of course we welcome the ceasefire that is long overdue. These children now face homelessness, hunger, lack of access to medical supplies, not to mention a disruption in their education. All children's lives are equal, whether they be Scottish or Gazan. So what is the UK government doing to protect the children of Gaza at this time?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And we are deeply alarmed by the disproportionate impact of the conflict on children in Gaza. He talked about education. I'll just mention that area for the interests of time, Madam Deputy Speaker. He's right about the extreme disruption. At least 88% of school buildings will need full or major reconstruction, and most, if not all, students in Gaza haven't had access to education since the 7th of October. The UK has been supporting work on this, including through the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and also via UNRWA as well. Thank you.
Final question, Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Since the ceasefire, we've seen an increase in killings and atrocities in Jenin. On Saturday, Israeli forces were responsible for the killing of a 2-year-old girl. The extremist settlers are acting with impunity against the Palestinians. So can the Minister explain what actions this government has taken to put pressure on Israel to prevent these ongoing atrocities in the West Bank?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the UK Government has been absolutely clear on this. Settler expansion and settler violence have reached record levels. The Israeli Government seized more of the West Bank in 2024 than in the past 20 years. That is completely unacceptable, and this has been raised by a number of members of the Ministerial team, not least the Foreign Secretary, and of course he has also announced new sanctions in October which were targeting illegal settler outposts and organisations that had supported violence against communities in the West Bank. Thank you.
Can I thank the Minister for her statement. As a point of clarity, members do need to be present in the chamber for the Minister's statement if they wish to ask a question. Can we have a small moment whilst the front benches swap over?